Hi, good morning. I'm Gabe Johansson, co-owner of Live Nutritious Fitness, and today I've invited Nate Darnell. He's a research analyst for Diabetes Support Services, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about ionized alkaline water, some of the myths and facts surrounding that. Good morning, Nate. How are you?
Good morning, Gabe. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me in studio this morning.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here. Nate, tell us a little bit about the history of alkaline water and ionized water.
Sure. Well, I think it's important. Thanks for letting everyone know what my background is. I work with a community outreach organization here in Salem, and it's geared predominantly towards improving quality of life for the diabetic population. And a couple of years ago, I was introduced to the technology you're referring to, and coming from a scientific background, I was very skeptical of the technology, and I guess fortunately I was exposed to it from a Fulbright scholar, so she kind of strong-armed me into looking at some of the genuine clinical documentation, and we actually found additional, and we've since put together an entire compendium. But what I also found in the process was that there was so much misinformation online, and it was overwhelming. It was overwhelming even for someone with a technical background. It seemed that there were people that were making all kinds of absurd health claims about it, and then there were healthcare practitioners that were claiming that it was complete snake oil and bunk. And my job was to kind of sift out the truth, from what was not truthful, and to kind of shoot down the middle and figure out, what's actually accurate. And so it took me about 2.5 years to do that. And ultimately, what I discovered over time was that there was a historical narrative of the technology which is inaccurate, and that's many people believe that it originated in Japan. And it didn't actually come from Japan. It actually came from Great Britain in the late 1800s. And it was used predominantly for disinfection purposes. Then it was used in World War I for surgical disinfection. And it was only during World War II that the technology was introduced to Japan. And they began using it following a lot of the devastating consequences of nuclear radiation exposure, starvation. They had a broken medical system after World War II. They had lack of pharmaceutical medications. And by happenstance, they discovered that electrolyzed reduced water, which is the correct technical term for ionized alkaline water, was very effective at reducing intestinal abnormal fermentation, dyspepsia, acid indigestion. And from that point forward, it became kind of like an aspirin to the Japanese medical system. And so it's been around for several decades. And it's really been refined in Japan, but that's not really where it came from. Okay. And interestingly enough, it was in the United States in the 1920s as well. And it's hard for me to decipher exactly why it didn't continue in the healthcare environment in the United States. I would hazard to guess because many of the byproducts are not palatable, they're natural, that it didn't fit into the business paradigm of Western medicine. And again, Japan has a very different medical system than we have in the United States. They have a socialized healthcare system that was really rebuilt after World War II from the standpoint of genuine disease prevention, right, not from the standpoint of disease treatment alone, which is what we practice in the United States. And that's why we rely so heavily on synthetic pharmaceutical medications instead of preventative measures. And again, my opinion is that ties in more to a business model than to the end game of optimal health. So really, it was refined in Japan. It was developed in Great Britain, went through the United States. Interestingly enough, we used it on the Apollo and Gemini space capsules to produce potable water, heat, and electricity for the astronauts. In the United States, it kind of remained pigeonholed in both the aerospace and automotive industries. And it really didn't come back to the United States until about 10 years ago. And I think the real challenge was that when it did come back into the U.S. market, it didn't come through academic or healthcare channels. It came through entrepreneurs who, by and large, whether or not it was intentional or accidental, it didn't have a very strong technical background, and they began explaining the technology in a way which was technically inaccurate. Yeah. And this kind of narrative has perpetuated over the past couple of years, and it's contributed to a lot of misinformation about the technology. Great. Well, how is everybody doing today so far?
Great.
Great. Good. Great. Well, good. Like I told the other classes, I'm just like my dog. I have ADD, which is attention deficit disruptive disobedient disorder. So if you fall into the classification of ADD or ADHD, you're in good company. I don't care. Stand up, swirl around, do whatever to be respectful of your neighbors. Okay. I'm going to try to stay on track with following kind of a linear progression. But if any questions happen, we might divert all those things. So Kelly wanted me to talk today, or at least present information to you, because I sit on the board of directors at Diabetes Support Services, and part of that is functioning as a research analyst to review technologies that are used not only in Western healthcare, but from around the world, and to really separate the wheat from the chaff, so like separate the evidence-based research from all the marketing hype, and introduce you guys to some of the newer tools that we use for health management, especially within the diabetic population. Okay, is all that kind of like good in a nutshell?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
All right, so one of the breaking things that we're working with right now is hydrogen gas, and using that with our clinical diabetic population. And that has, in your medical training or nursing training, has anybody ever talked to you about this?
No.
Okay. All right, so I want to be very clear in that when I'm talking about hydrogen gas, I'm referring to H2, not H+. H+ is really acidic, don't drink that bad. Okay, H2 is two hydrogen atoms with extra electrons, so they can donate electrons. They're actually very, very, very unique in that hydrogen, also in hydrogen gas, also known as dihydrogen or diatomic hydrogen or molecular hydrogen, tomato, potato, whichever one you decide to pick, they're all the same thing. What's very unique about it is that it can pass through, it's small enough to pass through cellular membranes, including the blood-brain barrier. So it can immediately arrest things like hydroxyl radicals, which are the most cytotoxic free radicals of all in the human body. And H2 can immediately bind with that and suppress it. It immediately converts into water. Okay. So.
Wait, so what happens to the hydrogen? I'm sorry. Is that getting too far off track?
Well, perhaps, but right now what we know is that the hydrogen gas immediately binds with the hydroxyl, and then you just get water out of it. So, I mean, that's what the science says thus far. And there's no negative effect, or there's no cytotoxicity at all. And that was also, fortunately, based on 30 years of military research where they used it for super deep sea diving, where they had Navy divers breathing a very specialized exotic gas mixture called Hydrolix, which was 49% hydrogen, 50% helium, and 1% oxygen. And they would breathe that down to like 600 to 1,000 feet. Something crazy. Yeah. And what they realized was that there was little to no cytotoxicity from that at all, even at those very high concentrations. So with that said, there was an interesting phenomenon that transpired in the early 1990s in Nordenau, Germany. And there was a slate mine that's in that location in Germany. It was a slate mine during World War II, and it had since been converted into this special resort. And there were a large number of individuals that were suffering from terminal illnesses that went there for their last hurrah. And coincidentally, many of them had spontaneous remissions from their diseases while they were there. And it was enough to where local medical professionals got wind of this and were really curious. And so they went to investigate. And indeed, they did document that a large number of people did encounter spontaneous remissions, and they didn't know how it was happening. Long story short, I'm not sure how it really transpired, but they were able to enroll some Japanese physicists and scientists who were able to travel to Germany to perform quantitative analysis on the area, including the cave and the water. It just so happens that the slate mine itself had been converted into a large wine cellar. It was this large cave, but it had a stream running through it, a natural stream, natural aquifer. And the Japanese scientists discovered that there was a large quantity of hydrogen gas that was being evolved from the cave. And this was coming out of solution that was in the water. So the water was rich in hydrogen gas, which it stays in solution for a period of time. And then it immediately starts going through standard kinetics, and after 24 hours, it's kind of out of the water, and after 48 hours, or at 24 hours, it's at half-life, and then 40 hours, it's out, that it's floating around in the environment. So these people that were going into this wine cellar, or this area of the resort, were not only respirating hydrogen gas, they were also drinking what they called therapeutic water. And that was coined the North Now phenomenon. Yeah, so the physicians encountering this did a follow-up study on 411 diabetic patients. And what they discovered during this study was that after 6 days of consuming this water, biomarkers started changing measurably. LDL cholesterol was dropped by about 15%, HDL cholesterol was elevated by 7 to 8%. They encountered significant increases in insulin sensitivity. And in some cases, they had complete reversal of metabolic syndrome and diabetes type 2. And that was consuming between 1 and 2 liters per day, which is the equivalent of between 4 and 8 glasses in American terms. Okay, so that's where I came to this from the diabetic side. Now, why I started investigating this is because I started investigating the Japanese healthcare system. We started noticing with our diabetic population in the United States that quality of life wasn't what we thought it should be in their later years. In Western medicine, generally speaking, diabetes is handled to some extent through dietary control, to some extent through physical fitness, but to a large extent synthetic pharmaceutical medications. The problem with this approach in the long term, and I don't want to harp on Western medicine too bad because we're great at what we do, which is emergency management. We're great. I mean, if you get like an arm lopped off, this is the place to be if you want to put it back on, right? But when it comes to long-term care, the numbers don't lie. We're 49th in the world as far as longevity, and I think over the past month, the first day infant mortality rate for all industrialized nations, we were number 1. I mean, we have the highest death rate for first day infants of any industrialized nation on the planet. And that was research that just broke over the last month or two. Yeah, so when it comes to long-term health in the United States, these are numbers that we really have to take a look at. Same thing with diabetics, synthetic pharmaceutical medications. They're at much higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease and cancer as a result of chronic inflammation and free radical damage. Right? So as they progress in life, frequently they're on more antibiotics to stave off infections because they have a lack of blood flow to their lower extremities, which then puts them at more risk for diabetic ulceration and then inflammation. So they're on lots of medications. After 30 to 50 years, then their kidneys take all they can handle, then they end up with tubular necrosis and they end up in hemodialysis. And then life really sucks. And then you have to ask yourself, what's the point, right? So especially once they start encountering amputations. That's a total life changer, that's a game changer, right, in a bad way. So my job at DSS, Diabetes Support Services, was to look at all the available evidence, separate the evidence-based research from the marketing hype, and figure out how could we best serve our patients. What else was available that we weren't using? Is this how it has to be done, or is this just the way that Western medicine does it? And technically that's what we encountered, which was this is the way Western medicine does it. Is that really because it's towards optimal health, or are there other underlying issues involved, including both business and politics? Well, the answer is yes. And I'm not going to go into those today. But what I had to look at was, well, what other options are available? And then we started looking at the Japanese system, which was very unique. It's also important to note that the Japanese have the highest life expectancies of any country in the world. They also have one of the lowest infant mortality rates of any nation in the world. They were number 1 for years. I think it's only been the past 5 or 6 where they've dropped to number 3. But they've also been nuked 3 times. They smoke like steel factories. So even so, they're still doing pretty good, right? You know, pound for pound. What's very unique about their medical system, though, is in the 1950s, they implemented something called Ninjin Doku, which roughly translated means human dry dock. And after World War II, they were dealing with a devastated medical system, shortages of pharmaceutical supplies, large loss of life. Those that were still alive, they were still dealing with radiation damage, starvation, malnutrition, a litany of issues. And to make matters worse, policymakers in the United States really muscled in, wanting to psychologically cripple the Japanese culture because they knew that they were very proud and determined people, and if they didn't really crush them, they might come back. That was the philosophy of the time. So the Japanese that were left, especially the policymakers, really did genuinely believe that they might be susceptible to ethnic annihilation. And so to preserve their numbers, they implemented a process called Ninjin Doku, which was
turned out to be, as it progressed, the most progressive and results-oriented disease prevention healthcare system ever established. And over the past 50 years, those numbers bear themselves out. They now have the longest life expectancies of any nation on the planet. And what they did starting in the 1950s was they mandated that every single important policymaker, engineer, CEO, contributor to the community had to go into a hospital 2 weeks out of every year. It was like a motel stay, where they stayed there and they were scrutinized from top to bottom to head off any illnesses. Okay? And out of that, they started developing other methodologies for disease management. And as far back as 1965, they began using electrolyzed reduced water, which is rich in hydrogen gas, although they didn't understand the chemical kinetics at the time. They just knew that it worked against acid indigestion, dyspepsia, chronic diarrhea. And it's kind of their Tylenol, right? I mean, or aspirin. You know, if we had aspirin produced today, it would be heavily regulated. But because it's been around for 80 years or longer, you know, you just buy it over the counter. Very similar. So it wasn't until the Nordenau phenomenon they really realized there was a component of this that could really be used with the diabetic population. And that's how I started discovering all this research. Okay. And it's also interesting to note that if you start going through PubMed and you start looking at all these articles, almost none of them are done in the United States. They're all in foreign countries. So the Nordenau phenomenon discovered that hydrogen gas alone, just routine consumption, could significantly change biomarkers for the better of the diabetic population. Then we have additional studies, which this one's double-blind placebo-controlled, diabetes type 2, demonstrating the same concept using synthetically produced hydrogen from electrolysis. We can produce hydrogen gas in one of two ways. We can either do it through hydrolysis, so we could drop magnesium in water, and that can off-gas hydrogen, but that's really difficult to control, right? There's no way to really shut it off or modulate it except just removing the magnesium from water. But if we use basic electrolysis, electricity through water, what happens? What's water? H2O, right? So if you run electricity, it breaks it apart, right? And what do you get?
Hydrogen and oxygen.
Hydrogen and oxygen. Okay. So if you do it really rigorously, then you completely gasify the water and you end up with, you know, two big balls of gas, which are really explosive and really dangerous.
Yeah.
Okay, if you do it, that's why they use it for fuel and rockets and stuff of that nature. It works great because the byproduct is water, right? It's like, if they could run that in cars, it'd be great too. So if you run weak electrolysis, you can actually stabilize, for a period of time, the gas in solution. So you can stabilize the hydrogen gas in solution for up to 24 hours. You'll still have a little bit of bleed off, so we know for the first 4 hours, it stays at maximum concentration, and then over the next 48 hours, then it begins to bleed off until after 48 hours, it's pretty much back to equilibrium. Same thing with, we can embed oxygen gas in water to create a low-level antimicrobial. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But I think Kellyanne wanted me to share this information with you in large part because she wanted me to open your minds to alternative technologies that perhaps are not being shared in your training. And then there's another component. Not only do we have to worry about the long-term ramifications, the negative ramifications of the routine consumption of synthetic pharmaceutical medications on our physiology, but we have to think about the environmental impact as well, right? So when we start looking at what's happening 50 years after Western medicine went gung-ho on antibiotics and all kinds of pharmaceutical medications, and after we deregulated the marketing process, and now we have direct-to-consumer marketing for prescription medications, we're now detecting residues from all kinds of prescription medications in our watersheds and in our water supplies, including significant amounts of antibiotic resistance. Okay, now the problem with this is that the municipal water treatment plants that were designed 50 and 60 years ago were never designed to filter out these residues. So they're trickling through, and up to 93% of them still make it through the system, and they end up in our river streams and in our drinking water. And there's currently no scientific way to understand how all 2,000 plus of these chemicals, residues, are going to interact and cause an impact on our long-term health, the health of wildlife, our children, sometimes they're one and the same, and then the environment itself, right? So this is becoming a real problem. Same thing with antibiotic resistance. Right now, as of last month, at the same time we were getting our negative numbers for infant mortality rates in the United States, The chief medical officer in Great Britain indicated that antibiotic resistance in Great Britain has become such an issue, it's now an issue of national security. And they're not even dealing with MRSA anymore, now they're dealing with CRE. And CRE is the nasty redheaded stepchild to MRSA. MRSA is bad, CRE is horrific. And there's no way to really treat it. So these are things that we really have to start thinking about with regard to how do we, as we proceed with not only Western healthcare, but just healthcare around the world, how do we proceed in a way which really produces positive results in ways that cost very little and respect our communities and the environment? And that's not necessarily an easy challenge, especially when there are politics and business models in the way. You know, from a scientific standpoint, it's really not that difficult sometimes. It's all the middlemen that oftentimes add complexity to it. Pardon me while I've been jibber-jabbering. While I get a drink of water, I know I've been dominating the conversation. Do you have any questions?
Is it only effective for type 2 diabetes?
Not at all. It will not change the insulin production or lack of insulin production in type 1s. What type 1s wrestle with in their long-term, in the progression of their disease, is collateral damage to all their other organ systems. They don't die from diabetes. They die from cardiovascular disease, cancer, and everything else that's caused by significant amounts of free radical damage, kidney failure, liver damage. So hydrogen gas significantly suppresses free radical damage and therefore preserves significant amounts of their tissue and retards the progression of their disease. So even in the case of someone who is renally compromised, instead of drinking maybe, you know, like a glass, you know, every 3 or 4 hours, you just give them a little whiskey shot every single hour. You know, so they're consuming between 1 and 2 liters per day, but they're doing it on a routine basis. So they're not having, their bodies and having to wrestle with a large influx of liquid. They can just get a little shot, you know, routinely, and it makes it easier to manage.
On the other study, it said their average stay there was for 6 days. So were the results that they saw, did they last for a long time?
On that study, I don't recall, but I know my recollection is that within 6 days, that's when they started seeing the biomarkers change. Between like 2 and 3 days, they didn't see that many changes. On the subsequent studies that were done in genuine clinical settings, because they couldn't do a double blind in the cave, there were too many other factors involved. But in the double blind, such as this one, that was done over a period of 90 days. And the benefits were only had as long as the water was being consumed. So it's one of those things where you have to keep doing it. But the good thing is that it's not just for diabetics. I mean, this across the board, when you look at the epidemics that are occurring in the United States and around the world right now, almost all of them have the underlying condition of chronic inflammation and free radical damage. And if there's a way to arrest that cost effectively and non-toxically, we can significantly arrest the progression of numerous diseases throughout the world.
Would you recommend it to a healthy person?
So, yeah, sure.
Well, with that, I mean, is there any risk of decreasing the inflammation process too much with this? You know, is there?
Not based on current evidence. And that's in large part because hydrogen moves to the body very quickly within 15, after consuming water, within 15 to 30 minutes, it's already completely circulated throughout the body. And it's utilized within 3 to 4 hours completely. So you have to keep consuming it. And hydrogen gas is different from other antioxidants such as carotenoids and polyphenols, like from green tea, or carotenoids from carrots, lycopene from tomatoes. Those are big molecules. And you know, what berries?
The goji.
The goji berries.
Yeah.
Most of those molecules have a lot of electrons that they can donate, but they're big, and they can't fit through cellular membranes. Hydrogen can because it's so small. So it's very short-lived. It doesn't have like hang time like the other molecules do. Because they'll float around in tissue like carotenoids will float around for weeks. You know, and once they bump into a free radical, you know, they can donate an electron, and they've got some extra ones to donate. Hydrogen doesn't, so it's kind of a one-hit wonder. But as long as you keep it coming in, it'll keep doing its job. And so you can respirate it too, but that's significantly more challenging because now you've got hydrogen floating around in the air, and anything above 4% atmospheric concentration, again, is an explosion hazard. So the safest and most effective way of taking it in is simply enriching water with it and drinking it. And again, the safest and most effective way is through a medically certified electrolytic water generator. So, and did Kellyanne give you any of the documents that I sent 2-3 months ago? Do you have a case study that you're working on? Like I vaguely recall like a female that was like 50 plus, ovarian cancer, diabetes type 2.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I want to kind of stay on track with that and not diverge. So I told you I've got the ADDDD7. I'll just talk for hours about all kinds of stuff. So in staying on track with that case study, she has ovarian cancer, right? Is that what it was?
Yes.
Okay. And do we know if she's undergoing radiotherapy or chemotherapy?
She just had a hysterectomy, but we don't know
So-
what's gonna happen now.
Okay, so we don't know what kind of therapy she's going to. Okay, all right, so she's just out of surgery. Okay, so we know now how hydrogen can be applied to the diabetic population, and perhaps, depending on her position, how it could be applied to her, right? Depending on if she's in Japan or the United States. It all kind of varies, right? Japan, they'd be really open to the United States. They'd have to go through a lot of clinical documentation, which is the same stuff I'm presenting to you today. Okay, so with regard to tumor treatment, cancer treatment in the United States, that's a hot potato, and for a bunch of different reasons. But this information I'm going to share with you today, I want you to be open to, because you're kind of the front line when it comes to healthcare. Physicians are well-meaning, but oftentimes they're very myopic, and you guys deal with the real stuff and have a lot more common sense in my experience, because you have your feet on the street every single day. So when it really boils down to it, you guys are really going to be the ones guiding the physicians. The physicians go out to their little seminars and stuff and learn about what is supposed to be cutting edge, but generally that's because pharmaceutical companies want it taught that way, not necessarily what actually works the best for optimal health over the community. So with regard to hydrogen gas, the Air Force Colonel, I think his name was William Paul Fife or Paul William Fife. He was the Air Force Colonel who was in charge of hyperbaric oxygen therapy and development in the 60s. The Air Force started heavily investigating hyperbaric oxygen following the high altitude secret surveillance flights from the U-2, because that was the first time pilots were really flying at super high altitudes, breathing 100% oxygen. They weren't sure what the effects were going to be on the human body. And so they had to learn about things like hyperoxia and lung burns and premature aging and all that stuff. He moved on from that to work with the Navy and Sea Lab, which was an underwater laboratory, where he then studied breathing gases such as hydrolex, which is 49% hydrogen, 50% helium, 1% oxygen. And then he went on to study hyperbaric hydrogen. And that's kind of dangerous stuff, because now you have a highly pressurized environment with hydrogen gas, and that can be very explosive. But there was a hunch in 1967 that because cancer is highly associated with free radical damage, which causes DNA denaturing, that if there was a way to arrest the free radical damage, that we could effectively stall or significantly suppress the development of cancer. So that was a hypothesis in 1967. And then they did an animal study in 1975 using lab rats and intentionally infecting them with squamous cell carcinoma, which is skin cancer. And what they discovered was that when they were exposed to 97.5% hydrogen, I think like 2.5% oxygen in the atmosphere, within 2 weeks, all of those cancerous lesions had completely resolved. Okay, now what's interesting to note is that following that research, continuous research in the United States went black on that topic. No other research was done. Okay, I don't have the answer to that. In looking at all the research, there's no logical way to justify why that was done. There's certainly conspiracy theory, there's politics, there's business, all those play into it, no doubt. But there's no logical reason why it should have been stopped. From that point forward, all additional information or all additional research regarding that topic had to be done outside the United States. And that's where the Japanese started doing their research. And again, the Japanese have a medical system that's geared towards genuine disease prevention, and they do that because they were genuinely concerned about ethnic preservation. That's different from the way the Western medical healthcare system works, which never had to undergo that process. Our medical system was never based on cultural or ethnic preservation. It was based on a business model that was developed in the early 1900s, and it's continued to this day. So those are things that we have to think about. What I have to think about when I'm doing my research is, is Western medicine doing this because it's truly effective, or more effective than other options, or is it because that's the way that clinics can easily bill for it? And is it easily billable that way because of policies that have been put in place, and why were those policies put there? Okay, so in 1975, this was the study that was done by Dr. Fife. You can find this also through, I think it's available on PubMed, it might have been on a different database. What I've realized is that a lot of the oncology research isn't necessarily replicated. PubMed replicates almost all research unless it's oncology. It's interesting. I think there's political issues involved in that too. So just food for thought. In 1999, Japanese researchers started figuring out some of the mechanisms of action with regard to hydrogen-rich water on tumor cells. And the hydrogen, which is contained in electrolyzed reduced water, that's why it's called reduced, has an effect on telomeres on tumor DNA. Telomeres are little end caps which allow DNA to replicate, and as long as the telomeres are long, they can continue replicating. They don't know exactly why it does this, but they know that electrolyzed reduced water, which is rich in hydrogen gas, suppresses telomeres on tumor cells, thereby retarding the development of the tumor.
Only tumor cells, or?
It appears to be selective.
Okay.
Not in healthy cells, only in tumor cells. They don't understand why. That's just, it appears to be selective. Okay? Now also, it's important to recognize that radiation exposure causes hydroxyl radicals, which are the most cytotoxic free radicals in the human body. When a hydroxyl radical experiences or connects with hydrogen gas, what's the byproduct? Water. H2O. Okay? So technically speaking, in Japan right now, they're investigating the routine consumption of electrolyzed reduced water as a countermeasure against nuclear radiation exposure following the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster. Because it's cost effective. Perhaps one of the reasons why it's not more utilized in the United States is that it's a natural substance and it's not patentable. And therefore it cannot be highly controlled. It cannot be, the creation of it can't be artificially suppressed, and therefore the price cannot be artificially inflated. It's curious to note that chemotherapy drugs in the United States often carry a 1,000% markup compared to their sale in foreign countries. Why is that? Well, when you talk to the pharmaceutical companies, they scratch their heads and they can't figure it out. That's not technically true, they just don't want to tell you what the reason is. When they're called to Capitol Hill, also, they scratch their heads and claim they can't figure it out. But they're patentable and controllable, right? And if they need to increase their profit margins, they simply restrict supply. Does anybody know what the cost of cancer is, like on average, in the United States?
Too much.
So, I mean, for instance, if you're diagnosed with cancer, on average, the cost to an American citizen, if you're diagnosed, regardless of the kind, you'll be dead within 3 to 5 years, and the cost of your care will be $350,000 plus. Those are the stats. 1 in 3 of us will be diabetic by the year 2050 if we proceed with the direction that we're going. 1 in 2 of us will have cancer. And we'll certainly all have cardiovascular disease if we keep using the same system that we're using. Okay, so it's important for us, especially you guys coming into the field, it's important for me to share this information with you, not for the sake of beating down pharmaceutical companies, not for the sake of criticizing physicians, but to open your minds to other options. Because when you're out there wrestling in the field, you're only as good as the tools that you know about. And if you know about other options, that's going to make you a much better healthcare practitioner. Okay? So if our potential case study undergoes radiotherapy for her ovarian cancer, was it ovarian or uterine?
Ovarian.
Ovarian. Okay. Fortunately, we did have a Japanese physician here in the United States working at the University of Pittsburgh, who's also a surgeon, and he's been very progressive with regard to research being done stateside. Again, note, he's Japanese, okay? And this was one of the more recent research articles regarding the use of hydrogen-enriched water to suppress damage caused by radiotherapy. So in essence, what the article says is that if the patient is routinely consuming water enriched with hydrogen gas, then it will help to protect all of the other organs against any collateral damage caused by the radiotherapy. Okay, which is often the case because once they're being treated, there are other organs that are affected by the radiation. Okay, same thing for cisplatin-induced nephrotoxicity. Cisplatin, very powerful chemotherapy drug. Okay, oftentimes it causes kidney failure, kidney damage. hydrogen gas. Significantly suppresses the damage. Okay. As you'll note, all this research, almost all of it is done in Japan. Any questions?
What are the barriers to access to this?
We use medically certified electrolytic water generators at the university level. And those are basically, it's an electrolysis machine that's been certified by the medical system in Japan, the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare. And they've been doing that since 1965. We can also use the same technology to produce water that's rich in oxygen gas. And if we use saline solution instead of water, then we can actually produce a very powerful disinfectant. We can actually produce water that is rich, here it is. We can produce an aqueous solution that's rich in about 17 ppm O2 and about 35 ppm free chlorine. That's technically called hypochlorous acid. And that is not to be confused with hydrochloric acid. Okay? Hydrochloric acid will burn your face off. Hypochlorous acid might dry your skin out. Okay? Hypochlorous acid is actually the same natural biocide that's in our white blood cells. Again, not patentable. However, what we do know is that we can produce it from basic salt and electricity. How does your body produce it? Basic salt and electricity. We just do it on a bigger scale. Okay, what's important to note about this is that it's completely biodegradable. Once it goes in the septic system, 12 hours, it's completely inert. Okay? We can suppress MRSA in 30 seconds or less using this topically. Yeah. So when we start thinking about antibiotic resistance and using all kinds of other synthetic pharmaceutical medications, which are done because they're patentable, controllable, and marketed, prices can be inflated, then we have something that is not patentable and not really that controllable, and is completely biodegradable and very effective against, it's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then you run into my problem, which is I've got big pharma on this side, and I've got snake oil salesmen on this side, and I'm just trying to shoot down the middle and share the evidence-based research and separate that from all the crazy, wild things that are being said over here, which are marketing hype, and then the political agendas over here, which want to drive in a different direction for increased profit margins. Okay? Now, in the case of hypochlorous acid, this is also very important for diabetic patients because they're much more susceptible to lack of blood flow to the lower extremities, development of diabetic ulcers, and then if an infection sets in, then potential amputation. So the general course in the United States is antibiotics to suppress bacterial load, and then some type of topical wound treatment to help with closure, if it happens. So we can also use hypochlorous acid topically, in a medical environment. It helps when we have a surgeon on board to be able to direct it, although it is non-toxic. That's done more for politics than it is for efficacy. Okay. This article was written 2012 actually. I think it was 2011, it was published in 2012. It's called electrochemically activated solutions. So that's currently the lingo that we use in the clinical environment for hypochlorous acid or any electrochemically produced solution that we can use as a topical disinfectant or like a solvent. Okay. Now, whoever wrote this is probably really proud. They're like, wow, I'm gonna get my PhD, I'm gonna get a job now, and they thought they were onto something new. No, they weren't onto anything new. This was used in 1915 in World War I. Okay, World War I. They used it on hospital ships. Okay, it was actually developed in 1889 as a means of sewage disinfection in London because they could use seawater, they could run electricity through seawater, they could produce dilute, they could produce a water that had dilute chlorine in it, which they could then use to disinfect sewage with. That's how it was initially designed. Then in World War I, it was applied to British and French hospital ships, which were military vessels, because they had mature electrical systems. Most municipalities did not. So even if you wanted to use this technology for sewage disinfection, it still was big, it was bulky, it was the size of this room, and it required a customized electrical system, which nobody really had at the time. But the military, always being ahead of the game, had sophisticated electrical systems on their ships. So they built electrolyzers out of cedar wood, carbon electrodes. And they dumped seawater in there because what's seawater? dirty saline solution is what it is. You already got your sodium chloride in there. So then they electrolyze that, and now they add an aqueous solution that was rich in oxygen gas and free chlorine, which they then use to clean the decks, wash the laundry, and treat surgical infections. Or treats, surgical.
2 minutes?
2 minutes. Wow, we got to wrap this up really quickly. Okay. And then the hydrogen-rich water, which is produced in the process, they just chucked overboard because the time was worthless. Okay, they didn't discover it actually had benefits until the Japanese began investigating in the 1930s, began investigating plants and animals. And then after World War II, because they had no pharmaceutical medications, their healthcare system was completely destroyed following World War II. They were open to other things, which is the same thing I'm trying to do with you guys, which is open your eyes to other things, and then they're much better off for it because now they have the longest life expectancies in the nation of the world. Okay, so with that said, we can use the same technology on diabetic ulceration. We had a 71-year-old case study last summer where we had a 71-year-old diabetic who developed an ulceration on the medial side of his right leg, just above the ankle. It initially started about this big, the end of a little pin. Within 4 days, it was that long and about 1.5 inches wide. Went to the oncologist, and the oncologist basically said, look, 71 years old, you have significant cardiovascular disease, significant neuropathy, I'd like to be able to tell you good things, but here's the reality, you're probably looking at amputation. Now, there's some things that I can't say because we're on video right now, which I said in other classes, so you'll have to ask them what I said. But ultimately, his wife shared with me some things that I also can't share on the video. But she was aware of the research that was happening at the university, and long story short, hypochlorous acid, technically called electrolytic sodium hypochlorite, was placed in the container. He spritzed it every 4 hours. Within 3 days, he had complete scab over. Within 3 weeks, he had 75% wound resolution. Within 6 weeks, it was completely healed with only a scar, with no need for antibiotics whatsoever. Okay, so again, there's another way of reducing the dependency on antibiotics, thereby reducing our risk of being exposed, antibiotic resistance, and then environmental factors involved in that too. Okay.
What kind of spectrum does the hypochlorous acid work on as far as antibiotics? Like gram-negative, gram-positive, everything in between?
That's a really good question, and I've got documentation that covers that, and I don't have it right on the tip of my tongue, but if you contact me via email, I can get it to you. Okay. What we do know, just what I remember right off the cuff: MRSA, Klebsiella pneumonia, Salmonella, E. coli, Staphylococcus, and over 40 other pathogens that has been tested on, including fungi, bacteria, and viruses. That's what I remember right off the cuff.
And could this be ingestible as well?
Generally not. It's generally topical only.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's because it's very oxidizing. So the good thing, though, is that even if you did do it, it's not going to have any dire consequences. Like if your child took a shot glass of electrolytic sodium hypochlorite, they might feel like awkward, but they're not going to die. If they took a shot of straight bleach, they would be in the emergency room probably dead. Okay, so when we're looking at safety, there's really no options.
So the way that we can implement this into our clinical practice is by educating our patients.
And if you can also influence your physicians, because here's the deal, most of them are so time-strapped, they don't have the time to review stuff like this. That's why I'm trying, that's why Kelly has me here today, to work with you guys, so you guys are aware of it. Because you will end up influencing them. Somebody like myself, they might take the time to listen, they might not. The fact that I'm an executive on a board for a community health organization, it helps, but that's certainly no shoe-in. And just because I drop clinical evidence on the table doesn't mean they're going to be open to it, right? Or understand it. And I really have to stick a fork in my eye sometimes because I'm appalled at what some physicians don't understand. And I do know that they're time-strapped, but it's frightening sometimes. It really is. And so I can spend a lot of time complaining about that, or I can spend my time educating. And I try to choose the latter. Doesn't mean I don't complain sometimes, but I try to focus on the other side. That's what actually gets the job done.
So when you talk about, you said electrolyzed reduced water is the proper way to call it, not alkaline ionized water.
Right. And I think, in my personal preference, is just to call it antioxidant water.
Okay.
Electrolyzed reduced is what we use in genuine technical documentation, laboratory and clinical studies. There's both electrolyzed reduced, which is antioxidant water, and then electrolyzed oxidizing water, which is an oxidizing water, which we can use topically for antibacterial solutions, for instance, like hard surface disinfection. What I discovered over time was that although the technology and the drinks were being sold, like this alkaline aspect was really the primary health benefit, and that's not technically accurate. Electrolyzed water, the antioxidant kind, is actually a very, very weak alkaline buffer. It's not like the equivalent of putting baking soda in water, which is very alkaline, and drinking that. It's a much more effective alkaline buffer. Nonetheless, that alone will not cure cancer either. But people consume it with the belief that it does. Now, it may have a positive impact in some individuals, but it's by no means a cure. On the other hand, what is very powerful about antioxidant water, which is technically electrolyzed reduced water, is that it contains a lot of hydrogen gas. And that's kind of distinct. Acidic solutions have hydrogen, but it's a single proton missing an electron. So it's stealing electrons, and that's why it's acidic. Hydrogen gas actually has complete electrons in its outer electron rings, and it can donate electrons. And that's what actually makes it a very powerful antioxidant. So we can, if you produce electrolyzed water through an electrolysis machine, the water will stay in solution for a period of several hours to several days if it's refrigerated. And if you consume it, it has strong health benefits.
So Nate, here at Live, we help a lot of the diabetic population as well. We do meal planning, nutrition counseling, grocery shopping trips, and we've had a lot of success with people reversing diabetes through eating the right kinds of food. What kind of success have you seen with the hydrogen gas-rich water in the diabetic population?
Yeah, we've seen some really good results using electrolyzed reduced water for daily consumption. We know it, and this is actually based not only on the clinical documentation that we possess, but actually on an event that happened 20 years ago called the Nordenau phenomenon in Nordenau, Germany, which is actually what kickstarted a lot of the research into both natural reduced water and electrolyzed reduced water. The event in Nordenau happened around 1992, and it was actually kind of an accident. There's a slate mine in Nordenau, Germany, which was a slate mine in World War II. It was converted to not a retirement resort, but kind of a regular resort hotel somewhere in the 1970s. And there's a cave that runs through the resort with a natural aquifer and a natural stream that runs through it. And several individuals had gone to this resort they were terminally ill, and they were there for their last hurrah, for lack of a better term. And several of them experienced spontaneous remissions of their diseases. And it was spectacular enough that several physicians from the local community came out to investigate and documented the events. And what came out of that was additional research where these physicians had enrolled the assistance of several scientists from Japan that were able to do quantitative analysis on the cave. And what they realized was that there was a significant amount of hydrogen gas that was being evolved from the cave. There was some organic process that was happening underground. The water itself was saturated in hydrogen gas, and then the air in the cave was also saturated. And again, it behaved like a very powerful antioxidant. So these individuals apparently had disorders that were resolved. I guess there was a very strong underlying component of oxidative stress. I don't know exactly what their diseases were, but it was significant enough to where it created a whole lot of spectacle. And then a follow-up study was done on several hundred diabetic patients, and what they discovered was that after 6 days of exposure to water coming out of this cave, now called the Nordenau water, their biomarkers began changing significantly for the better, and several diabetics were technically non-diabetic, diabetic type 1s. Of course, they were not cured of their disease, but they all had significant positive changes in their biomarkers.
Wow.
And this subsequently became known as the medically documented Nordenau phenomenon. And out of that came more research regarding a way to produce the water if you don't have access to the cave. There are only, I think, 2 to 3 places around the world that have this occurring naturally that we're aware of. One of them is in Nordenau, Germany. One of them is in Hida Tinryosui in Japan. And another one is located, I think, in Tilcote, Mexico, or Tecote, Mexico. But the only one that has really been highly documented is the Nordenau one. And again, many physicians, many healthcare practitioners are unaware of this. As a matter of fact, I've never met a single standard Western healthcare practitioner that has been aware of this document or this study before I shared it with them. I've met a couple of naturopaths that were mildly familiar with it, but not a standard MD. And so I really felt that it was important to start documenting this and making sure that they were aware of it. And again, within the diabetic population, using medically certified electrolytic water generators, we can produce a reduced water as well. And reduced simply means that's technical jargon for antioxidant. That's what we use in the laboratory setting. Oxidizing means that it causes rust. Reduced means that it reduces rust, for a better term. So we could technically call it antioxidant water.
Wow.
And I think that's easier for most people. I mean, it gets confusing with all the technical jargon after a while, but again, it's really not the alkalinity that's the therapeutic component or the health component. It's the antioxidant potential of the water that has a significant health benefit.
Well, I have so many questions for you, Nate, about the water, but thank you so much for answering some of those questions, and I hope that maybe we can do some videos in the future talking about some other questions that we have surrounding that. So it would be hydrogen gas-rich water, an antioxidant water, would really be a better way to refer to it.
Exactly, and I'd love to come back.
Okay, well here at Live, we really strive for optimum health and well-being through eating real food, and we teach our clients how to eat, how to find that and fit that into their day. And so adding this hydrogen-rich water sounds like a perfect way to add to that diet. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for being here. Hi, I'm Gabe Johansson, co-owner of Live Nutritious Fitness, and today I'm here with Nate Darnell, research analyst for Diabetes Support Services, to ask a few questions about electrolyzed water. Good morning, Nate.
Good morning, Gabe.
Nate, first question I had for you is there's a lot of talk about how much water we should drink. I've seen people say you should have 2 gallons of water a day. I've seen people say you should have 4 glasses of water a day. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's not so much my personal take so much as it is kind of a scientific consensus. And I've seen, as a research analyst, I see extremes on both sides. I see physicians that have an extreme opinion that we should be drinking more than that, and other physicians and scientists saying, no, we don't need that much. What we do know is that in 2004, the National Academy of Sciences really put a bunch of scientists to task, and they looked at a whole bunch of data, and it was even difficult for them to say how much we should really be consuming per day, because there are so many differences between human beings, based on size and whether or not they're engaged in a lot of athletics or not. But they pinned down some averages, and they said, for the average woman, she should be consuming about 2.7 liters of water per day. For the average man, about 3.4 liters of water per day. And when we're looking at, how can we translate that into, everyday, kind of measurements and terms, 1 liter is the equivalent of 4 glasses. 2 liters is the equivalent of 8 glasses. So of course, 3 liters would be approximately 12 glasses of water. So one of the other things is that we get a lot of our hydration from fruits and vegetables too, so long as we're eating a really healthy diet. So that doesn't mean you need to consume 3 liters of water or close to 3 liters of water. It simply means that's the recommended daily consumption. As long as we're eating a really healthy diet, we should be getting a lot of that from our fruits and vegetables.
Okay. So when it comes to electrolyzed water, there's a lot of talk about demineralized water and reverse osmosis. If an athlete or anybody is drinking demineralized water, what does that do to your body?
And that's another really good question. And I think before we even talk about that, I've seen some extreme examples of like overhydration, where I've seen kind of pseudo health professionals say, well, we should just drink water to our heart's content, and that's a very dangerous thing to do. Water can be just as toxic to us, in great amounts, as not having enough. And we know, for instance, it's one of like the three basic things we need for survival, right? If we don't have air for 5 minutes, we're going to perish. If we don't have water for several days, we're going to perish. If we don't have food, we'll perish after about 30 days. We can go for a while without food. But water is a critical need. At the same time, human kidneys can only filter out 1 liter per hour. So consuming significant amounts of water in short order, it can be hazardous. And the body has to do something with that water. It has to push it to the extremities. That can cause swelling in the extremities, and it can also cause headaches and migraines. Okay. So we really need to think about, well, how much are we really consuming per hour?
Right.
And right now, I think the consensus is, a liter or less per hour. Can you consume that throughout the day? Sure.
And so the effects are swelling, bloating.
Well, if you drink way too much, yeah. And then to address the issue of demineralized water, this again is one of these highly contested, controversial issues in the world of health management, which is, is it really good to drink demineralized water? And again, there was a World Health Organization paper that was published in 2004 indicating that there can be in health-related issues with a long-term consumption of demineralized water that's produced either through reverse osmosis or through distillation. And both of these technologies purify water, which has great importance because we're dealing right now with contaminants in our water supply that municipal water engineers never anticipated would even be there 60 years ago. So now we're detecting all kinds of pharmaceutical drug residues in our municipal water supply, all kinds of toxins from manufacturing processes. So it's not an issue of bad-mouthing reverse osmosis or distillation. It has its benefits. The problem is that they're so good at taking everything out of the water, they also take the good things out of the water, like calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium. And if we're consuming that water, it's electrically hungry. And it's going to start trying to steal those minerals, from whatever it touches. And if we're consuming large amounts, it's going to take it from us. And what the World Health Organization document talks about is the long-term consumption causes demineralization in the human body, and it doesn't happen overnight. You're not going to turn into like Jabba the Hutt and just melt or turn into the thing. But over extended periods of years, it can cause or elevate risk factors for things like osteoporosis if you're not consuming significant amounts of calcium and bone-building minerals in the process. And another concern is that it might actually damage mucosal membranes as well. So a lot of that, it's not, the science is not really hard on that, but there's definitely concern, and there have been enough studies to warrant it.
Okay. Other question I had for you was, we provide personal training here at Live. Is hydrogen-rich electrolyzed water something recommended for athletes then? Does it have a benefit to them or to people who are just training heavily?
Well, based on all the research that I've read, I think it has a benefit to everybody, and I think moderation is the key. And before we talk about the athletic side, I'd like to talk about the diabetic side. Okay. And because that's my realm of expertise, and just looking at the different options we have for diabetes management. And first and foremost, it's important for everyone to understand that diabetes is a global epidemic, and we often call it the silent epidemic because it doesn't receive nearly as much airplay or focus as it really should. It costs our nation $250 billion a year just to address diabetes and its complications, and that number is growing. I mean, we're dealing with adolescents that 20 years ago, it was unheard of for adolescents to be diabetic, and now 25% of American adolescents are diabetic type 2s. And we're not really sure what's causing all of that, but with common sense, we can look at just the standard American diet and say, gosh, look at the amount of sugar that's in this. Look at the amount of trans fatty acids that they're consuming, and we're allowing it to happen. But diabetes is also a gateway disease, and it contributes to accelerated development of cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, neurological issues, cancer, the list goes on. So really what a diabetic would encounter is what everybody else would encounter. They just do it a heck of a lot faster. Yeah. And they technically don't die from diabetes. They die from collateral damage to all of their peripheral organs through chronic oxidative stress. And this is what hydrogen really suppresses. And of course, with electrolyzed reduced water, hydrogen is the primary component that really suppresses this kind of oxidative fire in the human body. And it's not, I know a lot of physicians have concerns about antioxidants and people taking too many of them. And there's a concern about that too, because we do need oxidative processes happening inside the body for regular function. But it so happens that hydrogen based on existing research, it's selective. It doesn't disrupt any of those vital oxidative processes that we have to have working. It's very selective. It only suppresses, I don't know how it knows this, but it only suppresses those that seem to be bad or have a negative influence on the body. And with the diabetic population, we know that if they're consuming between 1 and 2 liters per day, which is what we've done all the studies up to, and that's essentially 4 to 8 glasses, we know that it increases their insulin sensitivity. So that is a good thing because it reduces the amount of insulin that they need. That also reduces the cost of their insulin. Insulin is very costly. We know that, again, consuming 1 to 2 liters reduces their LDL cholesterol on average by 15%, and that's the bad cholesterol. It increases their HDL cholesterol, which is the good cholesterol, by 7 to 8%. HbA1c is a measure of their average blood glucose over the past 90 days. And we know that that stabilizes, and we're seeing average numbers of between 7 and 6 on HbA1c levels just by routine consumption of the water. Does that mean that it cures diabetes? No, not at all. But we have seen in cases of prediabetes, we can reverse prediabetes if they maintain a regimented diet and they're consuming electrolyzed reduced water on a routine basis. It can reverse that condition, which I think is really important because once you're diagnosed as being a diabetic in the United States, that stays on your medical record indefinitely. And it will constantly elevate your cost of insurance. So it's really important that we keep our biomarkers in check and never receive that diagnosis because it's going to be significantly more costly down the road. Now, with regard to athletics, we're seeing something very similar in that we also know that the hydrogen-rich water, because it functions as a very powerful antioxidant and has some degree of acid-alkaline suppression kind of capabilities in the athletic population, we're seeing that it actually reduces lactic acid accumulation. So that allows the muscles to run longer and stronger. Right. So instead of loading up on all kinds of protein and everything else, and again, there's only a limited amount of protein that we can process per day, and there are lots of bodybuilders and athletes that are consuming way more than they actually need, or their bodies can even handle, which can also be very dangerous to the kidneys. But with regard to water, we also know the athletes, they might be a little bit different because they are sweating and a lot of the water is evaporating out of their system. They might be able to consume a little bit more. But still, we need to fall within that kind of National Academy's range, which is between 2.7 liters and 3.4 liters, unless they're just really sweating out. But in that case, they do need electrolytes and stuff too.
Okay. So I have a question. I went on a motorcycle trip this last weekend, and I brought as much electrolyzed water with me as I could. How long will the hydrogen gas stay in the water? Can you pack water for 2 weeks to go on a long camping type trip, or is it something that you have to keep just over the course of a few days?
Yeah, that's a really good question too, and it's actually not very long lived. So this is why we have to have machinery to make it on a regular basis. And we know that hydrogen, it can be slightly stabilized in water for several hours. So after production, it will remain dissolved in solution for about 4 hours. And then after that, it begins off-gassing, or it begins evaporating. And we know from the laboratory studies that after about 24 hours, it's about half of what it is at saturation. And then after 48 hours, the water is back to equilibrium, which is basically a scientific term for saying all the gas is gone and it's lost a lot of its therapeutic value. Now, the water will remain slightly alkaline simply because it has charged particles of potassium, magnesium, and sodium. And that has a little bit of a health benefit to it. And so even if you boil it, those don't go away. The water will continue to remain alkaline. But if you boil the water, or if you heat the water up, the hydrogen is going to dissipate even faster. So it's really important to have fresh water on a routine basis.
Okay.
Now there are different ways of producing, hydrogen-rich water. And if you are on the road, there are hydrogen sticks that you can use, which use magnesium hydride to produce that. You can do the same thing with silica hydride or even calcium coral hydride. The drawback to these, though, is that you can't produce a wide variety of waters. And this is why at the university level, we actually use the electrolysis process. Because we can buy one machine and we can produce all kinds of cleaning and disinfecting waters along with cooking waters and everything else. So it's actually a much better cost-benefit ratio to do it electrically than it is through hydrolysis.
Okay.
But there are other options. So if you're on the road, that might be one. But what I'd actually recommend, I'm not sure if you have any travel cases on your bike, but when we do our clinical studies, we try to find insulated flasks like the steel flasks, and we'll pre-chill them. And you can make ice cubes out of the electrolyzed water and contain the hydrogen in the ice as long as you put it right in the freezer very quickly. And then you can just drop some of those after you pre-chill your container, drop those in there, and then fill it up with water, and then you're good, for your bike ride, so long as you're not going to be on the bike for more than a day or so. And it works very well.
So that makes me think of another question. When I ran out of the electrolyzed water, I had to pick up I got a Aquafina from the gas station, and the first drink I took of it, it made me feel thirsty. It felt like it washed away all the moisture out of my mouth and my throat. What is it that makes this hydrogen-rich water seem so much like smoother and just more hydrated?
Yeah, well, and that's a really good term, because that's the same term that I keep hearing from people as they begin consuming the water. And I have to tell you, I have the same experience. I can't, having consumed the water for over 2 years, I can't go out and easily drink bottled water anymore. It tastes terrible to me. I can't drink tap water. I can taste the chlorine right away.
Yeah.
But there's an aspect of the water which is sometimes called microclustering. And this was a term that was used when they were doing magnetic resonance imaging in a research project maybe about 13 years ago. And I'm not really a fan of this term because it sounds a little spacey to me. In the laboratory environment, we might be able to get away with using it. I use the term reduced surface tension.
Okay.
And if you remember, you grew up in Oregon just like I did, and you remember the water skippers on the water.
Yeah.
They would slide across, and they're able to walk on water because there's this boundary at the top of the water which is like elastic, and nothing can penetrate it. So they can walk on it. What happens when the water is electrolyzed is that surface tension decreases. So the water can now penetrate membranes a lot easier than typical water can. And that doesn't last forever, but that's what happens when the water comes off of the cathodic electrode in the electrolytic water generator, otherwise known as a water generator. It does have reduced surface tension, and when you consume it, and this water also has hydrogen gas in it, when you consume it, it moves through your cellular membranes. It goes right through your intestinal lining much faster than standard water does. So translated, that means you're going to be super hydrated. It makes it right into your joints. And oftentimes, we're getting to that age where we're starting to not recover as fast as we used to. We might have a little bit of joint pain in the morning. We know that those who are 60 years of age and older generally battle this on a routine basis. And part of that has to do with they don't have the kind of synovial fluid in their joints that they used to. This water will make its way through the muscle tissue, through the joint tissue, and add an extra layer of hydration in those joints. So oftentimes they feel a lot better, and they don't need to take things like aspirin or painkillers like they used to.
Okay, good information. Thanks, Nate. That was Nate Darnell from Diabetes Support Services, and I'm Gabe Johansson with Live Nutritious Fitness. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.